Welcome to the Teach Joyfully podcast, where we talk about all things elementary teaching with some mom stuff thrown in. I'm Lisa Burns, and I'll be your host. Thanks for joining me. Today's episode is all about choosing and pairing books. You're going to love it. As many of you know, I'm passionate about literacy and teaching kids to love reading and writing. So today I'm here with Michelle Dunham to talk about reading, book selection, and giving kids a love for books and reading. She's a mom of 5, a book aficionado, an educator, and the creator of Ruby Reads Books, where she supports families and kids in creating a love for reading. Michelle, thanks for agreeing to come on the show today.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you. I have been a loyal follower of your Instagram account, and I love your passion for books and reading. So when did you discover a love for reading for you?
Oh, goodness. I grew up with my mom being a huge reader to us, and it just followed when I grew up. Obviously, then when I became a teacher, I loved sharing books with my kiddos in my classroom. And then as I became a mom, getting to sort of complete that cycle of sharing books that I had loved as a kid and had these great memories of sharing with my mom than with my kids.
Awesome. Yeah, it was the same for me, for sure. I think once a book lover, always a book lover, right?
Yeah.
Is your business called Ruby Reads or Ruby Reads Books?
It's really Ruby Reads, but we had trouble with, as a lot of people do, getting a website availability and Instagram handles. And good friend of mine who has a Bookstagram account, and we were chatting, and she was like, why don't you just put books at the end? Because you want people to know that you read books. I was like, that's brilliant.
There it is. There it is. Awesome. Okay, so I'm dying to know, who is Ruby?
Interestingly, so I said that my mom was just really instrumental in my love of reading. And she actually passed away when I was pregnant with my first child. And she had sketched out a bunch of little birds that we were going to paint on the wall in his nursery. And we were going to have it be a red bird. It didn't have a name or anything. But then when years later, I had the idea to do Ruby Reads, we thought, as you're sort of thinking through how will we communicate this and what will be sort of the brand or the characters, and I was thinking, well, it would be a wonderful idea to have characters who could love books and we could talk through the characters. And my husband and I were sitting on the couch. When I was a first grade teacher, I had a different last name, and we had Bullfrog book bags, which was our original book box. And I was thinking about frogs, and he was like, no, it's the bird. It's the bird that your mom drew. And it just felt so right to have it be this symbol that my mom had drawn for my kiddos' nursery. And that's just such a huge memory and a huge connection point that I have with her, even though she's not here, through books, through reading with her, and now reading with my kids, that it made sense that Ruby, this bird that she had drawn, would be our sort of mascot, if you will.
That's a great story. How cool is that you were able to incorporate your mom into this a little bit too? Tell me a little bit about what you do as Ruby Reads and how you got started.
So we do basically a couple of different products, but the goal of everything is to help families really connect and find joy in reading, find joy in learning together. I think sometimes it becomes a pressured thing where people feel performance pressure or kids feel pressure to be achieving at a certain level. And I really wanted to take that out of the equation and give parents and kids something to do together that would easily encourage this love of learning that I've always felt. And I did do, as I mentioned, book box in sort of a bag form. And when I was a first grade teacher, I created these mini units, if you kind of will, around a picture book. And I would send it home with a student, and they would do the set of activities with their family. And then there was always one product that they would make at the end and bring back into the class with the book and the bag, and then it would go to another student. So it would rotate throughout the classroom. And when I was then a mom, I still had these things in my box of teacher goods, and I started doing them with my kids. And I thought, this is so much fun for us to do together, like to experience it on the mom end with my kids and see that it's so much fun and so connecting. I love to have that experience with my kids. I think it's such a privilege to hear them talk about what they're thinking as we read together, as we learn together, as we do the activities. I love that. And I want other families to be able to do that. And so the inception really was the book boxes, transforming those into something that could go out. So we had to make some modifications from the original book bag, but that's what the book boxes are. And then when you're sort of in that mindset of creating, a lot of things come to you, right? So we also have always been doing read alouds in our family. And we were reading through the Little House series. And I thought, there are so many places in here where it would be great for us to stop and look this up or write this down. But if you're a mom and you're doing a read aloud and your kids are quiet, sometimes the very last thing you want to do is stop that and go look something up somewhere else. You want to stay in your groove. And I had done some photography printing on engineer print paper where it was really, really large. And I thought, okay, so what if we just put a lot of these things that we want to be able to reference or write down or do or keep track of on a big piece of paper and let them keep track and do those things while we're reading. And it's just a seamless part of the experience. Because I also had one of my kids who really loved to draw while we were reading. Like, it was really hard. It's legitimately hard for some kids to sit still and snuggle up with you and have this idyllic reading experience like a lot of us envision. But if you give them a piece of paper and some crayons and let them draw a picture of what they're hearing or do some other activity that's still involved with the book, but gives them some legitimate way to be active, it's so helpful. And so I just combined all of that into the read aloud poster design.
Wow, I think that's awesome. That's absolutely amazing. Just the evolution of how all of that came about. And that's so often, I think, as teachers and as parents, it's something that we do. It just one thing leads to another, doesn't it?
Uh-huh.
For
Absolutely.
sure.
I think when you're in a creative space and you're in a mindset where, especially if you have an idea and you already have a pathway, like I'm not artistic, but I have an idea of how I want things to look. Well, I had already talked with my friend who's a graphic artist. So I had that resource available. And I think a lot of times when you don't have pathways, it's hard you sort of mentally limit yourself. And then when you get going, there's so much that you can do.
For sure. Well, and it's nice to have those resources for sure, because it really does open up other avenues for things that maybe you can't do yourself. And I think sometimes too, one of the things I find for myself and even for other teachers is sometimes we just look at something, well, I'm not good at that. But the reality is there's lots of people who are, and we really do need to partner with someone who can take over the parts that we can't do. And it turns into something really awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have to do it all ourselves. I think so often as adults, even we just think we have to do everything ourselves, and we don't.
Yeah, that's a big learning, I think.
Yeah, it takes a lot of learning to get there, doesn't it? So, so choosing books to read aloud to kids and even just to stock a classroom library can be really time consuming and tricky. There's so much out there, and not all books are created equal for sure. It just can be so overwhelming. How do you personally go about choosing books, like for your family or for the book boxes or your read aloud posters? How do you choose books?
So I am a big believer in resources and not reinventing the wheel. And even when I was growing up, my mom had a book called Honey for a Child's Heart. And she would just go through and kind of read the synopses, and we would think about what we were interested in reading and, what she could get at the library. And now, obviously, we have Pinterest lists. We have lots of different things like that. but I think librarians or people who have book lists. So for what we do with our read aloud posters and our boxes, we have the luxury of being sort of at the beginning of a journey right now. And so for us to choose a book for a box or a poster, it has to check several boxes. The first box is always that we love the book. I feel like there's no use in helping a family get deep into a book and understanding it better if it's not a really great book. So we always start there. And then our product development journey is always we start with a stack of books that we think are amazing. And then we think about the potential within each of those. Some just don't lend themselves to what we want to do as well. You can have an amazing book, but it doesn't have maybe, or we don't have the creativity at that point in time to turn it into a book box. So our book boxes always have certain components. They always have a mini book that mom and or dad and the kid write together that connects back to the theme of the book. So they always, and then they always have a cross-curricular component, either math, science, or social studies. And then they always have some sort of construction component, because I think that kids really sometimes struggle to find good practice for following written directions and making a product. So we try to incorporate all of those things as part of a book box. And when you think about that, and then you think about the intersection of that, all of those things with a book that you love, that kind of narrows it down for us. So that's part of it. And the same thing is true for the read aloud posters. It's a chapter book that we love. It's sometimes we've tried so far to go with chapter books that are probably what I would call early transitional. They're not like heavily illustrated, very early chapter books, right? But they're early enough in a family's reading cycle that they probably may still have some kids who are struggling to make that transition from picture book to chapter book, which can be hard to go from having everything visual and visible for you as you're reading a story to trying to make that picture in your own mind. So we've tried to help bridge that gap a little bit with some of the graphics on our posters. So we're kind of aiming at that certain level. And then the ones that we've done so far have all had a strong visual component within the story that we felt like could really enhancing to put it on a poster. So that's just not true for all books. So we've had some what felt like very obvious choices to us to start out with. And then I think as we move forward, we may broaden our range. We may broaden our age range a little bit more. I think we'll just see how it goes as we move forward. We've had some requests for books that I think, oh, I don't know how we would do that. I love that book, but I don't know how we would do that yet. But I think as we move into it, we may find out how we would do that. It will be interesting to see.
Absolutely. Well, and that's exactly it. I think it's an evolution of anything like this. You just figure out what you're good at, and then, you can start branching out later on as you start to envision where else can we take this, and how could we translate that for this particular book, which might look a little different from the books that you're currently doing. Yeah.
Absolutely. We tried to start out with books with a few exceptions, actually. I don't think that The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane is a book that people know of and want to read already. That's more of a me talking families into it when I'm talking to people. But I have ultimate confidence in that book. I think it's a wonderful book because we're new and we want to sort of build up that trust in our book selection. We wanted to also start with books that people would have heard of. So Little House in the Big Woods, we've just released Charlotte's Web. We wanted to start with a few books that I think and hope families would want to and know of already and want to read together and have that experience. And then trust us enough to say, okay, I haven't heard of the Vanderbeekers, but I'm willing to trust you in this book selection, because I think that's a big thing, right? We only have so much time with our families. We only have so many books that we get to read together. And I think we want to choose them wisely. So we wanted to also start out with, just some classics that we hoped people would be wanting to read with their kids.
For sure. Just moving from that piece there, I just love where you're going with this. I think this has such incredible potential. And the reality is books are just there's millions of them and there's millions of fabulous ones. And I can't wait to see how it translates into other books as you go along. I think that there's just such potential there.
Thank you.
For good. Okay, so as a teacher, I pair books and I do sets of books that I teach from a whole week or even for an entire unit. And I know that you pair books as well. I've seen your 2 books Tuesday. So how do you go about choosing books to pair? What's your criteria when you're trying to pair books?
A couple of things. And I actually, when we started 2 Book Tuesday, it grew out of a conversation that I have with my kids a lot around books and wanting to sort of equip families with ways to um, inject or incorporate conversations about books, even when they're not specifically reading, sort of to infuse their family life and conversation with books. And
Sure.
also my background as a teacher and then my master's in my specialty or my area of interest was metacognition. And so I'm always thinking of ways to develop that through conversation, through the talk that we do at our house. So the 2 Book Tuesday really came about as an outgrowth of a conversation starter that I use with my kids all the time, which is, oh, that reminds me of another book we read. And we're at the point in our conversation now where my kids are thinking of those other books by themselves, right? So, or they will
Sure.
spontaneously, when we read a book, they'll say, oh, I think that must have been also written by so and so because this other book we read had this element or this element. And I really feel like that is a level of conversation that brings us such joy, where we're always connecting this book that we read with the other book that we read, or this person in the grocery store reminds us of this character in a book we read. And so when we're making those connections, I just think it's powerful and super fun. And so 2 Book Tuesday really started as a way to start giving parents fuel for that conversation. So when you first start having that conversation, it isn't like that they come spontaneously with all of the ideas to pair their books with, right? You
Sure.
need to start out with a couple of really good books that have some striking similarities that you can then discuss. And the more you do that, the more that you can step into. Right now we're reading these 2 books together, so the conversation is really obvious. Then eventually we'll do a book now and a book we read last week, and then we'll do a book now and they're just going to start talking about books that we have read in the past. So it's sort of a baby step to a larger conversation idea. When I started doing 2 Book Tuesday, it was really just to give folks ideas about ways that they could be pairing books. So whether it's they have a very similar theme, or they're by the same author, or they're by the same illustrator. How do we know that they're by the same illustrator? Well, they have these elements in common. I recognize this, or this is the same, but these things are different, right? So it's both parts of that conversation. When you talk about ways that the books are the same, the next thing that any kid will do whenever I've talked to them is talk about ways that they're also different, right?
Sure. Sure.
So just sort of thinking through, I love a good Venn diagram. And so thinking through, we start with what's in the middle. And then also the next part of the conversation is what's on the outside. Whether or not you can see that Venn diagram or not, that's your thought process. And a lot of it is it's really literary analysis. What are the elements that are the same and what are the elements that are different? And so when I pair, I just think through that. But some of my favorites are books by the same author, because that's a big thing at our house, is that authors are real people. And I think we're living in a day and age where that can be very fun to explore with kids. Like, so if there are people writing these books, there are things that are the same. They're not completely unrelated. You know, you have authors that like to use speech bubbles a lot, or you have authors that tend to do this or the other thing.
Right. Or maybe you have an author who really likes to write their books in letters or in postcards.
Exactly. And I think when your kids start to see that, they understand, okay, so and I think it translates to their own writing. Okay, I'm writing this book and I find that I like to do this. And that's okay for me to do it again. Everything that I do isn't a completely new thing. And I can be an author. And if I like to write my books using first person, or if I like to write about animals. Last summer, we did a Kevin Hanks author study, and my kids were like, okay, so we lined up all the books on the driveway, and we always do a timeline where we take the books and we physically put them in publication order. And before we did that, my kids were like, well, why does he always write about mice? And then we put all our books out, and they're like, you know what? Actually, he doesn't always write about mice, but it seems like his mice books are from this year to this year. And then if you look at the covers of these books that he wrote after this year, it changes. The illustration style changes, the subject matter changes. So, as an author, maybe he's doing something different. Also, he doesn't always illustrate his own books, right? Sometimes he works as the author and he partners with someone to illustrate. When is he doing more of that? So, just taking and this is not about Two Book Tuesday, I'm sorry, but
No, but it's exactly what we do as teachers, and it brings depth and meaning to all of this. So I love keep going.
I mean, and just to take it back to Two Book Tuesday. So if you think about it, it also, I think, helps them think through, story elements. So we had a pair that was Last Stop on Market Street and Nana in the City, which have some similarities in terms of setting, in terms of characters, but there's other things that happen that are different. So, and I think that when kids have a basic story vocabulary, that's a fun way to help them start to use it, because especially if you have more than one kid, they're always trying to come up with, and in a classroom setting as well, right? No one
Right.
wants to have, they always want to be able to add something to the conversation.
Sure.
So it gives them a authentic reason for thinking through the story elements. So, okay, so these are both set in the city, but actually this one they go into their apartment, this one they go on a bus ride, but they're both a kid and a grandma. How are they the same? How are they different? So those were by completely different authors and very different illustration styles, but some of the story elements were the same. And actually that was one where we had, obviously Last Stop on Market Street is in a book box, so we've read that a lot at our house. And then I happened to check out Nana in the City, and I had it sitting around, and my kids, I just think it's really fun to see what they connect it with. Sometimes it's the book you think they'll connect it with, and sometimes it's something totally different and wonderful, and you're like, oh yeah, I can see that. But that was one where I had Nana in the City because I thought it might pair, and my 9-year-old read it and he was like, did you get this to go with Last Stop on Market Street? And I'm like, why would you think that? And he could explain all the things, because we always talk through all that stuff. And it's a fun challenge. I think every kid loves a mystery. So as soon as you say, oh, that reminds me of this book I read, or oh, I'm thinking of a book I read they're like trying to guess what it is, right? What could it possibly be? And I think anytime that we inject an element of mystery and sort of asking them to put on their detective hat, yes, it's interesting to them, but it also necessarily engages their brain in a different way, where they really have to think through analytically, okay, why is she thinking this? What does she think? What could it possibly be? And they kind of go through their mental inventory. And I love to see that click on, and you can just hear it when they're talking about it. The level of engagement goes up, and I think they become confident in their own thinking about these books. I think that's a great way to think about literary analysis and using picture books with kids who are older. So my kids are 9, 11, and 12, and we still do this with picture books all the time. We do it with the chapter books we read as well, but chapter books are,
An investment of time,
through, right? They're not a snapshot, but you can take a snapshot with a picture book easily. I will say I also will pair chapter books with picture books that are similar thematically. and talk about them that way. Like when we read Mr. Popper's Penguins, thinking about that and pairing it with One Cool Friend, which I think is a picture book that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, but I love, which is a little boy who he thinks his dad isn't paying attention and he sort of cons him into letting him have a penguin for a pet, which if you read Mr. Popper's Penguins, you can obviously see the similarities, right?
Right.
But the way that they meet their needs. So now you're tying it into science and habitat, right? The way that they meet the pets' needs are slightly different in each book. And kids love to kind of think and compare and contrast. So I think there's lots of different ways that I've paired books back for Two Book Tuesday. But I think the other thing is when you think of it, think of what is the book that it reminds you of. I also like to make sure that, because I don't want to ask kids to do something that I can't do, right? If it doesn't seem similar to me, if I don't see a similarity and I can't talk beyond one or two things, then it doesn't make for a good conversation. And it's a thin, fast conversation that is not very satisfying to anybody. So if you set your kids up with two books that don't really kind of play off of each other well, and you're just like, oh, tell me how these are the same, and they can't think of anything, I think that's an inherently unsatisfying conversation. So I always like to try it myself before I ask them to think of a book that it would go with.
Well, and it's interesting because pairing books can be done in a million different ways, and then it is the conversation. And I have to say, as a teacher, one of the ways that I create those conversation is just talking about them throughout the day too. Even if it's a chapter book, you can talk about the characters like they're old friends, and can say, oh gosh, you sounded just like whoever it is that you're reading about in a book, Laura in Little House on the Prairie right there, when you said such and such. And so the next thing you know, it's like, well, what do you mean? And then you can have an entire conversation about, what that sounded like and how this particular moment standing in the lunch line is suddenly the same in some way. I think that's how we hook kids into reading and into a love of books, is really talking about them like they're old friends.
When I was growing up, two things. My whole family had sort of their character that my mom assigned them in Winnie the Pooh that we each were so much like. And I think, and so I was, well, sometimes Eeyore and sometimes Winnie the Pooh. And I think my mom would, and my sister was Tigger and my little sister was Roo and she was Kanga. And I think when you can make those character connections, again, kids are like, this character has these qualities and I'm like this. And I think it just puts you in the story. And also, I think it's one thing in a classroom, but also at a family level too, right? It's important enough to the adults that it's not something that we're doing because we have to, or it's an assignment. It's a part of the way that we're thinking. It's a part of these, these characters are now part of our family. They're like us. When I was growing up, my mom and her best friend were Frog and Toad. And my mom was Toad and her friend was Frog. And everyone knew why they were those two characters. My mom loved to sleep in the morning. She was a slow goer. She liked to eat cookies. And her friend was a real go-getter, fast twitch fiber kind of person, liked to get her morning run in. And we knew that about her. And they wrote letters to each other as Frog and Toad. And I mean, it was so ingrained in the way that we talked about books that we see ourselves in the books. We expect to see ourselves in the books. And so I think that you can't help talking about that. And I think then it also, for whatever reason, I'm not sure exactly, maybe it's because authors are so funny and we're able to step outside of ourselves a little bit, but I think we're able to see the fallibility in those characters and then also in ourselves. So our house, we have trouble getting going in the morning sometimes. And have you ever read Me First?
Oh my gosh, one of my favorite books.
I have this witch voice that I'm pretty sure that my family will, like, if I, at my funeral, they will try to like imitate this voice for me because it's so iconic. And whenever my kids don't get going and everything is running slow, I just pull out my witch voice and ask them, like, who's going to be the first to do whatever. And all
You
of a
too
sudden,
can be the first.
yeah, right. And all of a sudden, it's not me nagging them. It's us sharing in this moment of not wanting to get out of bed in the morning. Who will be the first to get in the bathroom and brush their teeth? Well, it's not me nagging them anymore. It's us all kind of collectively remembering this funny book that we've read through their whole lives. And everyone laughs. And then everyone runs to the bathroom. And I think it's all those funny, like, little bitty ways that we weave in the books that we're loving together that are helping to bind us together and tie us together, where it could have been a really conflict laden moment, but instead it's flipped in a second and it's funny and we got the job done. And so I think the more that we can weave in those kinds of moments throughout the day, just like you're saying, like when you're standing in lunch line, and I think that it becomes, again, part of what gives us joy in life, not part of the thing we have to do. That is what we want, right? We want our kids to love to read. We want them to see the joy in it. We want it to give life, not be a thing that we're worried about or stresses us, or is just one more thing we have to check off the list at the end of the day, because that will not sustain for the long haul.
No, absolutely not. If anything, that kills a love of reading. And I think it's really easy to go to those links because kids are reluctant readers or they're just readers who haven't been introduced to a love of books, and they maybe don't have a good model in their home, and so here you are just trying to force, okay, where's your checklist? You need to read 20 minutes a night and parents need to sign off on that. Well, you set a timer and that book is now a chore.
Yeah.
It's no longer a joy. And it is true when you say, just weaving it through your conversation, books and reading and literacy and writing and those kinds of things really almost need to become a fabric of your day. They become a culture. Either you create a reading culture in your classroom or in your home, or you don't. And everything you've described is exactly what I believe about creating a reading culture. It just becomes part of your conversation, and it is a way to diffuse hot situations for sure. For sure. You can put on a voice or, quote a character. We used to call it midbrain stuck. Your brain is stuck in a mode and you're angry or upset or in your curmudgeon mode or whatever it is, and it kind of jolts you out of it. Then you can suddenly think differently, and it just reframes your thoughts. I'm even just walking down the hallway, you can say, oh, you know what? Let's listen for footsteps, just like Lily in Lily's purple plastic purse. She loved her click, click, clack of her feet on the hallway in the school. And, those kinds of things. It's so easy once you start doing it, but it's hard at the beginning.
Yes. Yes. I think it begets itself, right? And then you're in that mode, and then it's so easy to keep going.
You can almost set yourself up to by writing some things down and having some things and being prepared. I know this happens in our home or in our classroom a lot, so I'm going to be prepared because this is going to take care of that moment. And then, once you start, kids will jump right in.
Yeah. And I think as an adult, I think it's so important to be freed up to be creative and silly and funny. And I think books help you get in touch with that part of yourself. And it's hard, I think. I mean, sometimes when you're in the like grind of task and adulting and everything, I think it can be sometimes hard to get back in touch with that part of you. So it takes a little practice, right? It's a little bit of, let's read this great book. And what it is for me will be totally different from what it is for someone else. But that's part of your creativity as a mom or a teacher is, okay, this resonates with me and I can see that my class thinks this is funny. I'm going to pull this back out sometime. And it's not necessarily a conscious process, but it could be, right? Especially when you're
Sure.
getting started. Like
Sure.
if there's a book that your whole class is side splitting laughing at, then like go with that and pull it out again. Like don't be afraid to have it come back. I call those comfort reads, right? So
Sure.
there are things that, especially, right now we're in sort of a tense time and my kids are, of course, way old enough to read to themselves. But you know what they want to read is picture books that we have loved reading together. And on especially stress-filled days, they'll just bring out a stack of picture books. And I kind of just note, what are the ones that they are pulling out? What are the ones that
Right.
they love and have great memories associated with? And I think any community of readers can do that. You can have your
Sure.
sort of touchstone books in your classroom. When I was teaching, I remember we loved Tuesday, but just as a wordless book, right?
Right.
We would just come back to it, partly because I mentioned our mascot was the bullfrogs. So we loved frog books. Like, there were things that help you develop an identity. And when you tap into that, these are our books. This is our family book. And every family or every classroom is going to have different ones. And you can sort of go with the classics and start from there, but yours are going to be different from someone else's. And that's because you're different. Like, it's all part of your creativity, how you weave it in and what makes sense to your kids. I think those are all different, but you have to allow yourself that time and relax enough that it comes to you.
Sure.
I think
I
that's a
agree.
part of the gift of it.
I agree. I agree. And every classroom is different. So what worked last year won't work this year, because there's a different group of kids and they have a different sense of humor. They have different things that they like. I'm a firm believer in matching books and kids and not forcing books on kids. And so, you really do have to do some investigating in order to do that. But I teach all day long with a book in hand. There isn't hardly anything I can't teach with a book. And most of it's picture books, but I use other texts too. You use poetry and you'll pull out a chapter from a chapter book or an excerpt from a chapter book or, whatever it is. Maybe you're teaching, if you're older kids, you're teaching all of history through a historical fiction. There's all kinds of ways to do that. And I think that it enriches everything that we're doing and learning so much. But I think picture books are an essential for teaching even through high school. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Just trying to wrap up a little bit here. When we talk about your posters and your book boxes, I think that teachers can take a look through that, and it's great for home. And even for school, you could pull something like that in, even just to spark some creativity and start with a poster. And you could almost do it as a class, give kids a chance to kind of do different parts of it. I think it could be really cool and interesting. How big are your posters? I think they're pretty large, aren't they?
Yeah, they're 28 by 40. So we usually think it's good for maybe 4 or 5 kids. I've had teachers do it with a classroom set of, depending on your class size, right? Everyone can be doing it on their sort of table or in a small group of 4 or 5 while you're reading. Or we've had teachers do kind of just a single one for a group that maybe needs to do something by themselves, sort of like just like a novel unit, but kind of do it either way, I would think.
Sure, sure, sure. And it certainly would be inspiration for kids and for teachers to take a jumping off point and maybe even doing some sketchnoting and creating something of their own as well, maybe later on with books. And once they've seen one and tried one, I think they could really take off and do some interesting things with that. So I think it's such a great way to just rethink how we're responding to books.
Yes. I just really want kids not to have to do worksheets, but also to recognize that there is value in writing things down. So like in our house, we've done timelines on big sheets or like timelines and we clip them on a literal rope with clothespins.
Sure.
We've done things on the driveway. So I think there is such an importance in writing things down and getting things out of your head when you're listening to a read aloud. And I think that we've, at least in a large part, kind of ignored it. Like, we're either listening to a read aloud or we're reading independently and doing some sort of productive work like after we read. But I think that the combination can be really powerful especially for kids that need that little boost to see that, okay, there is this structure. And it's not that it's a worksheet that they have to fill in. It's a way to make that structure visible so that they can take notes and kind of see, okay, so Edward this is a pattern throughout the book. He has a certain owner and they put him in certain clothes and call him a certain name. And Edward is a certain way at that point in the story. So on our poster, we have all those blocks that are those things. And I think it would be worksheety if you ask them to fill it in afterwards as sort of a comprehension exercise. But when you're doing it as you're reading, it's a way to keep track so that it's easy to have a conversation later and say, oh, look at
Right.
how they changed. Look at how he's acting differently now. And this is what I heard in the story at this point that made me think he was like this. And now here's what I'm hearing now. So it's a conversation aid or a discussion aid. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that that aren't on a
Fill in the
read
blank
aloud poster,
worksheet
right?
for sure.
So
For
yeah,
sure.
but
Yeah.
you don't
Yeah.
you don't have to have a read aloud poster for that.
No,
It can be super helpful, but you can take those same ideas and kind of adopt them to a lot of different books.
sure.
So
Well,
I hope that it's helpful for in a lot of ways.
yeah, and I think it's a way to help kids quite often process. Sometimes some books can be really complicated, and you think about the Westing Game or some of these other books. I mean, it's a great book, but it's complicated, and kids have a hard time with that. There's other ones too, and I think it's a great way to help kids process and kind of focus on things that are important for sure. Wow. Well, I have so enjoyed talking to you today. I can tell you that teachers are going to love so much of what you do, and even the suggestions for translating that into their classroom. It just is such a great way to create a reading community, and I'm very excited about that. So how can my listeners find you? You have a website and maybe your Instagram account?
Sure. So we're on the web at rubyreadsbooks.com and also on Instagram at Ruby Reads Books. We try to do a lot there that I think could be helpful in a classroom, but also I would love for teachers to help families by giving them that as a resource. We try to do a lot. I'm really passionate about seeing families do things that extend what you're doing in the classroom into the home so that we don't see this dichotomy. So hopefully it will be helpful for teachers, but also as a resource for families.
For sure, for sure. And that's something we're always trying to do as teachers is how do we help families really connect with books
Mhm.
and become committed readers too as well. So thank
Absolutely.
you. So that's it, my teacher friends. Thanks so much for joining us today. If you liked today's episode, I'd love it if you'd go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen and leave a review. And while you're there, hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss an episode. Also, you can continue the conversation with me in my Facebook group, the Teach Joyfully podcast community, where elementary teachers can connect, get help, and encouragement for all kinds of education and parenting topics. You can find the show notes on my website at www.hopeineducation.com/podcast, along with all the links mentioned in the episode for Ruby Reads. And remember, a happy teacher is a good teacher. Until next time, teach joyfully and take care of you.